What if I told you there's still a piece of Germany under Russian control, one that's never been returned, never reconciled, and never forgotten? A Cold War holdover, militarized and isolated, yet now, on the verge of becoming something entirely new. This is the strange story of Kaliningrad. And for the first time in decades, Russia might be willing to let it go, with quiet help from the United States. Kaliningrad. A name that doesn't quite belong on the European map, and yet, there it is. Sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania, completely detached from mainland Russia. Most people don't realize this patch of land was once Königsberg, a German city rich in history, culture, and power. It was the birthplace of Prussian kings, the home of Immanuel Kant, a jewel in the German crown, until it wasn't. After World War II, the Potsdam Agreement redrew borders and reshaped lives. The Soviets took Königsberg, expelled the German population, and renamed it Kaliningrad. A new identity, a new loyalty, and from that moment on, it became Russia's military stronghold in Europe. But here's the twist. Today, Kaliningrad might be more trouble than it's worth. Russia has pumped money and military assets into the region for decades. It hosts the Baltic Fleet, missile systems, and tens of thousands of troops. From Moscow's perspective, it's an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a permanent thorn in NATO's side. But behind that show of strength lies a different reality. Kaliningrad is isolated, economically strangled, and increasingly disconnected from the rest of Russia. Every truck, every shipment, every civilian train has to pass through NATO territory. Lithuania has already imposed restrictions. The EU's sanctions make life harder. And with the war in Ukraine stretching Russia's resources thin, some in Moscow are beginning to ask, is it worth it? Sources close to diplomatic circles say the idea isn't fantasy anymore. It's quiet, delicate. But the question has been raised. Should Russia sell or relinquish Kaliningrad? And here's where the United States enters the picture. The U.S. has no direct claim to the land, but it has a stake in the balance of power. Washington sees an opportunity, an off-ramp for Russia, and a rare chance to redraw the map without firing a shot. Behind closed doors, the U.S. is exploring frameworks for a transition, not a return to Germany, but possibly a new status, autonomous, neutral, and demilitarized. The pitch? Russia gives up a costly, indefensible outpost. In exchange, it gets sanctions relief, partial reintegration into the global economy, and perhaps, most importantly, leverage in shaping the post-war European order. But it's not that simple. Hardliners in the Kremlin would see this as betrayal. Giving up Russian soil, even if it's surrounded by NATO, is political suicide for some. And yet, the economics are brutal. Kaliningrad is subsidized heavily by Moscow. Its population is shrinking. Its future is uncertain. On the European side, Germany is cautious. It has no public claim on the territory, and it's wary of stoking historical revisionism. Poland and Lithuania are watching closely, fearful of instability but curious about the prospect of removing a Russian military foothold on their border. The people of Kaliningrad themselves? Most were born there after the war. They've only known life under the Russian flag. But the prospect of becoming part of a neutral, European-aligned entity might appeal to those tired of sanctions, shortages, and international isolation. Could it happen? Possibly. Not overnight, not through headlines, but through back channels, careful diplomacy, and a willingness on all sides to rewrite the terms of history. Because in the end, Kaliningrad is more than just a relic of war. It's a symbol of empire, of division, of stubborn borders drawn by exhausted powers. And now, it may become a symbol of something else entirely, a geopolitical compromise brokered not with tanks, but with terms. Kaliningrad's future is uncertain, but one thing is clear. The world is watching, and history doesn't stay frozen forever. This is the story of Kaliningrad. And for the first time in over 70 years, serious voices are asking, could Russia actually let it go? And is the United States playing a quiet role in reshaping the answer? Let's begin with the facts. Kaliningrad is an exclave, geographically separated from the rest of Russia by over 300 miles. It's sandwiched between two NATO members, Poland to the south, Lithuania to the north and east, and the Baltic Sea to the west. It's small, about the size of Northern Ireland, but strategically vital. Yet before it was Kaliningrad, this city had another name, Königsberg. Founded by the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century, Königsberg became the heart of East Prussia, the eastern edge of the German Empire. It was rich in culture, deeply German, and home to figures like Immanuel Kant, whose grave still lies there, now paradoxically guarded by Russian soldiers. For centuries, Königsberg was a proud European city. But everything changed in 1945. As the Second World War came to a brutal close, the Red Army stormed into East Prussia. The city was heavily bombed, then occupied. At the Potsdam Conference, later that year, the Allies, led by the U.S., U.K., and USSR, redrew Europe's borders. Germany would be split, Eastern Europe would fall under Soviet influence, and Königsberg would disappear. In its place, Kaliningrad. Named after Mikhail Kalinin, a Soviet official, despite him never setting foot there. The Germans were expelled. The Russian language replaced German. Orthodox churches rose where Lutheran ones once stood, and a deep layer of Soviet identity was laid over what had been unmistakably German soil. For the Soviet Union, Kaliningrad was both a trophy and a weapon. It became one of the most militarized zones in Europe, home to nuclear weapons, submarine bases, and military-industrial infrastructure. It was their unsinkable aircraft carrier in the West. But the Cold War ended, and suddenly, Kaliningrad was a problem. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the newly independent Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, cut off Russia's land connection to Kaliningrad. Now, everything going in and out of the region had to cross NATO territory. At first, Moscow managed. Trade flowed, borders opened. There was even talk of Kaliningrad becoming a Russian Hong Kong, a liberalized trade zone connecting East and West. But then came the war in Georgia, then Crimea, then Ukraine, and now full-scale war again in Eastern Europe. The result? Kaliningrad is once more isolated, sanctioned, and surrounded by a Europe that sees it as a threat. And this is where the discussion turns radical. Within Russia's strategic community, some are starting to whisper what once was unthinkable. Maybe Kaliningrad is more of a burden than a benefit. It's expensive, difficult to defend, surrounded by hostile alliances, and constantly at risk of becoming a trigger for wider war. In an age where Russia's economy is under siege, where military resources are stretched thin, and where the Kremlin is seeking ways to reduce Western pressure, Kaliningrad starts to look like leverage. And in this calculation, the United States becomes the quiet architect. While no official discussions have been made public, diplomatic sources suggest the U.S. and European allies have floated scenarios in which Kaliningrad could be transitioned into a new status, possibly neutral, possibly under European supervision, or even a special economic zone with international oversight. What would Russia gain? Several things. First, sanctions relief. The West might be willing to offer economic incentives in exchange for de-escalation. Second, a rare diplomatic victory. Moscow could claim it's leading a peaceful solution in Europe, something it badly needs as the war in Ukraine continues to damage its global standing. Third, deniability. If Kaliningrad is not given away but restructured, the Kremlin can frame it as a strategic, voluntary move, not a loss. But here's the real question. Would Russia ever truly let go? The answer depends on who's in power. For hardliners and nationalists, giving up any territory is unthinkable. President Putin himself has built much of his legacy on reclaiming, not releasing, land. But if power shifts in Moscow, whether through transition, upheaval, or necessity, new calculations could emerge. On the other side, Europe and the United States would need to tread carefully. Germany, despite Kaliningrad's past, does not seek its return. Reclaiming former territories opens a Pandora's box of unresolved post-war questions. But a neutral Kaliningrad, a demilitarized region under international governance, That's something European capitals might support. Poland and Lithuania would demand guarantees. No more Russian troops, no more missile systems, no backdoor deals. The local population, nearly 1 million people, would also need a say. Most are ethnic Russians. Many were born after 1991. They've lived under sanctions, under international scrutiny, and under fear of becoming collateral in the next great conflict. A new future might offer them economic hope and political freedom. But there are risks. If not handled carefully, a transition of Kaliningrad could spark panic in Moscow. It could provoke retaliation. Or worse, it could trigger a military reaction if seen as NATO encroachment. This is why the U.S. role is critical, not as an enforcer, but as a mediator. A behind-the-scenes broker that can offer Russia a graceful exit while reassuring Europe that balance will be preserved. It's not the first time the U.S. has played this role. From Cold War arms treaties to the reunification of Germany, Washington has long helped manage the delicate architecture of European security. Kaliningrad might be next, because in